I was checking that got to be chicken. Kikawichi Gosia, Kakegi was away. Yakaka Kasoketa mark. She was got Ganana Pateta Markum Match on Nana took Shigi Way Spike. Magananaskumana Kegi go, she got paid chicken. Then an Askaman, hi, then Askaman.
Sure, you want to talk a little bit?
What's happening here today is, coming together to look at these papers that have been drawn up, working together with to end sexual violence in Saskatchewan. It's good. It's going to be as easy as the way we think, but it's also going to be very difficult if we think that everything is difficult. I would like to think that it's going to be easy when we rely on Creator to help us to do all these things. It will be easy. But if we try to control it ourselves, then it's going to be difficult. We have to allow Creator to help us out, to pave the way for us and all of us to get well and also to stay well. And also, I always say women have to be responsible for their healing, because we are the ones that bring children into this world. We carry them for 9 months to bring them into this world. We are strong. We have a lot of power, but we take that power when we start using drugs and alcohol to heal ourselves, to remedy ourselves, to forget about everything. We just teach our children, our little children, our teenagers, and they're going to follow everything. So we need to educate everybody to heal ourselves first, to get ourselves well. And if we can heal ourselves, then we'll be able to heal other people. We are only responsible for our own wellness. Even just by staying sober and leading a good life, other people benefit from it because they can count on us. They can rely on us to help them, be there for them. And sometimes the woman, we have to extend our hand to reach for them and to pull them up and walk with them. And we have to use our Nehia way of helping each other. And we cannot look at the words like enabling and things like that. Those are Monial words, those ones. In our way of life culture, we don't think like that. We think about saving lives. We think about, helping each other. But as soon as we start thinking about enabling, we're not going to be able to, that's an obstacle that's going to throw everybody off. So we have to be brave. We have to be strong and believe in ourselves that we're going to be able to do this project. And it's not going to be the end. It's only the beginning. And we have to continue the wellness. We have no choice. And we have to have wellness programs in a community for everything. When people go to treatment, we have to have a follow-up by having wellness. And also we have to use culture as part of our wellness. And also land-based healing is something that's really, really going to help us. We have to go back to the land, go back to Mother Earth, go back to the language. All the programming, there should be language in there. There's everything to me is easy. I don't have a formal education, but I have great common sense. And I know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I also know what's right and I know what's wrong. Those are the things. And, I learned lots by life's experience. My grandmother raised me. And also, we have to look at sexual abuse in different ways. We look at it one way that we look at things, but we have to also educate our young girls that sexual abuse comes in different forms. Even having sex with your husband, unwanted sex when they're high or when they're drunk, that's sexual abuse too. But people think just because it's your spouse that it isn't. So we have to really educate ourselves and to be, we have to be really honest to talk about and not be afraid to talk about something and not to be ashamed, because we were taught to be ashamed. We cannot talk about sex. We can't. But now we have to talk about sex. We are forced to talk about it. If we're going to get well, that needs to be addressed. And everybody has to, we all have to be responsible for this program if we want our people to get well and to stay well. So that's what I wanted to say about this program. And it's going to be a good program. We have to have faith in what's happening.
Thank you, Elder Maria. I would now like to invite Betty Ann Potruff, the chair of Sass Board of Directors, to provide remarks on behalf of Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan. Welcome, Betty Ann.
All right, thank you, Ashley, for the introduction. And I also want to thank the elder for her words. They're very, very important words and directions for us all to follow. And good morning to everyone, and a virtual elbow bump to everyone in these days when we can't get together. I miss the social contact, as I'm sure you do. As said, I'm Betty Ann Potruff, and on behalf of the Board of Directors for the Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan and the member agencies, thank you for taking the time to be part of this event. I'll refer to Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan throughout this presentation through its initials, Sass. So that's what you'll hear for the remainder of my presentation. Thank you. Sass is a provincial nonprofit organization that works collectively with frontline agencies, community partners, and governments to provide support and advocacy to those affected by sexual violence in Saskatchewan. For over 30 years, Sass has witnessed the critical work that our member agencies do to engage and support survivors, often with limited and very stretched resources. It's no secret, and it is sad, that Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of sexual assault violence victimization in the country. When a person experiences sexual violence, it impacts on them profoundly. The trauma impacts on them, their family, and their community, its health and its wellness, as the elder indicated. In 2017, Sass and its member agencies started on a journey to develop Saskatchewan-based research to inform the development of a collaborative, inclusive, and multi-sectoral provincial sexual violence action plan. That action plan was released last May in 2019. The aim of the research that's being released today, the report that you've seen, Sexual Violence in Saskatchewan, Voices, Stories, Insights, and Actions from the Front Lines, is to help develop a comprehensive understanding of sexual violence in Saskatchewan through an examination of sexual violence experiences and the existing strengths and gaps or weaknesses in service provision. This is the first comprehensive sexual violence research report conducted in Saskatchewan. It was inspired and driven by individuals, community, and agencies committed to creating a province free from sexual violence in all its forms. We are deeply appreciative of and moved by the candor, resiliency, and strength of survivors, their family members, and friends who participated in this study. And we know that for many, this report tragically has come too late. We also appreciate and commend the frontline workers and advocates who continue to support survivors in communities across the province. On behalf of the Sass Board of Directors, I want to convey our deepest gratitude to everyone who participated in this study, provided feedback and expertise, and supported the research team through the process. We are especially grateful for the support and expertise that the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Women's Secretariat, the Saskatchewan First Nations Women's Commission, and the Prince Albert Grand Council Women's Commission provided. They ensured that this research accounted for the historical and ongoing institutional and structural violence that Indigenous persons face in Saskatchewan. Lastly, we are grateful to the Department of Women and Gender Equality, the Government of Canada, for funding this project as part of a federal strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. Now, despite the grim statistics and the heart-wrenching stories outlined in the report, we know that working together and with a purpose, Saskatchewan has the capacity to change the story of sexual violence in this province as experienced by our citizens and in our communities. Adequate investment and engagement of all partners, that's individuals, communities, businesses, governments, nonprofits, through cross-ministerial and multi-sector approaches can help us all achieve a vision of a Saskatchewan where every person is free from the threat, fear, or experience of sexual violence. Thank you again for your participation today.
Thank you, Betty Ann. I would now like to invite Chief Bobby Cameron to provide greetings from the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, the executive.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, morning, Chief.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. Can you see me? Oh, there we go. I want to say this, Nigan Manto, Kanaskamon Miyagis Galmegwats, Gakyo, Memopi, Agipipixmian, Egua, Nochum Maria, Naskamon, Yigagi Sumuak, Kamsak, Katamskatan, Gakyo, Ipipixmiak. We want to say thank you to our Lord, our Creator, for a beautiful day today. First and foremost, we thank our Nochum, our Kokum Maria for the prayer this morning and her advice. And to all the ladies that are here, all the mothers and all the grandmothers. I got the invite from Vice Chief Heather Bear, and I wasn't sure. Just looking at the list of the participants and all the great work. I'm just at a loss of words. Honestly, like it's the work you ladies are doing, and the advocacy and the healing journey that so many of our people are still on. It's such a good feeling to know that this organization and all the partners that are involved, that we're all here together to do this. Wow, I'm just so amazed. Honest to God, I really am. I just can't express the feeling that I'm feeling inside my own heart, and all the work you're doing. We would like to say for each and every one of you and all the work that you do, and Vice Chief Heather Bear, the issue of sexual assault and the violence. Perhaps I should even, we need more men involved. We need a lot more men involved to say, we're here to be with you, to stand beside you, to stand behind you. Whatever you feel that us men need to do, we will do it. To save any of our children from, or prevent any of our children from experiencing these types of actions from others. Just some quick stats. I heard some of the comments that we have the highest rate of sexual assaults in Canada. This province of Saskatchewan, we need a lot of work to do. We're also leading the country in youth that are smoking cigarettes. We lead the country in the highest rate of impaired driving charges. Like, these are embarrassing statistics, and there's no reason why we should be leading these statistics right across the country. So we need a lot more men involved. And personally, what I would like to do is reach out to our Premier Scott Moe and others to take an active role in showcasing and highlighting that this is something that we should all do together, and to support this awesome movement, this special movement, this special advocacy that is going on with today's meeting. It's so awesome to see all you ladies. It really is. Even though I've never seen some of you, but I can see in your eyes and your hearts that you're here for the right reasons. You're here for the passion that you have to do the work with sexual assault and other things. I mean, it's our everyday life to raise our children. So those are my comments, that we will continue to do what we can from our federation. The fact of the matter is that our woman, and no woman should ever be abused for any reason, whether it's physical, sexual, spiritual, emotional. And I can honestly say this, and I'm proud to say this. I was one of those men that thought women should serve me, that they should listen to me. And it took the mother of my first 4 children to leave me, to make me a better man, to make me follow the sober life. And you know, it's been close to 10 years since she left me. And since that day was the day that I decided to be a better person inside. And I thank her to this day for doing that, because she saved my life by leaving me. And we've become really good friends since. You know, we laugh and you know, we joke around, and you know, it's been a good journey for myself too, on from that perspective. You know, a lot of men, they have different addictions. Mine was alcohol and drugs. And I look back on it now, I'm sure thankful and grateful that our Creator, our God, gave me the strength to listen to the woman, to understand the role of the woman in our homes, in our communities, and in our families. And I have no problem speaking this to anybody, because that's what I experienced. And to each and every one of you, for the things you do. We all have a story to tell. Each and every one of us that are on this call, everyone right across this country, we all have stories of survival and hardships, and how we all overcome certain things to get to where we're at in life. And we're still healing. We're still healing. I just want to say this, for example, it was August 18th, 1984 at about 5:30 p.m. when we lost my late father. He was 32 years old. I was an 11-year-old boy. We got hit by a drunk driver, and I watched him die in front of me. And my little brother and sister were in the back crying for Dad, asking for Dad. And I said, Dad's sleeping. I could see him breathing for a few minutes, and then he quit breathing. And something there, like, the Creator told me, you got to be strong for your little brother and sister. And it just came out like, Dad is sleeping. We'll see him later. So that's what I mean. Like, we're all still healing from certain events in our lives. Thank you all once again. We can't express the importance of this work, the special meaning it has for our children. And personally, like I said earlier, I'm going to reach out to certain leaders, and men especially. Let's be more actively involved with this. Let's be a voice with this group, and for our women especially. I do apologize. I have to join another Zoom meeting. Thank you all for listening to me today, and just a little bit of my life and what I went through, and what it took for me to understand the importance and the role of women in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Cameron. I would now like to invite Vice Chief Heather Bear to provide remarks on behalf of FSIN Women's Secretariat and the Saskatchewan First Nations Women's Commission. Welcome, Vice Chief. Oh, sorry, Heather, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Elder Maria Linklater for her prayers that were rendered this morning. I am coming to you from the Ojibwe First Nation in the beautiful unceded and unsurrendered Treaty 4 territory. So on behalf of I'd also like to thank Chief Bobby Cameron for joining us and showing his support and sharing his humble words. On behalf of the Saskatchewan First Nations Women's Commission, it gives me great pleasure to represent the Commission and the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Women's Secretariat at today's event. When the Secretariat was invited to participate on the Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan, Sass, Advisory Committee, we understood the importance of this work. And this was an opportunity to get involved with a project that shares so many of our values and aspirations. As many of you may know, the Saskatchewan First Nations Women's Commission is the recognized political voice, and for over 30 years has been a strong advocate for restoring and revitalizing the roles of First Nations women in our nations. I want to highlight one important piece of legislation that the Commission led. In 2017, the women leadership emphasized the need for widespread awareness about violence against women and girls and brought a declaration to honor Indigenous women and girls. And this was brought to the FSIN and also to the, later on that year, to the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations. And the declaration was a commitment made at our highest level of First Nations governments to take responsibility for an action to address the disproportionate victimization of Indigenous women and girls. Based on this commitment, the SFNWC and FSIN Women's Secretariat have been working diligently to support important initiatives such as this one, to identify and act on proactive measures to address violence against women. When our paths crossed, Sass and the Women's Commission joined in efforts with the help of the Prince Albert Grand Council Women's Commission and our SFNWC Women's Advisory Council, which is represents all the women council in our region in Saskatchewan. We wholeheartedly supported the research to uncover strategies to challenge sexual violence and change societal attitudes. We were extremely supportive of the research lens that took into consideration the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma and the overrepresentation of Indigenous persons as targets of sexual violence. We also recognize that any response to sexual violence from an Indigenous perspective that begins with culture and encompasses the spiritual, emotional, and physical and mental domains impact on the victim and the perpetrator and their families. And of course, will have a long-term effect, and hopefully we will be able to turn the tide. FSIN Women's Secretariat looks forward at moving ahead with the strategies identified, such as the actions highlighted under prevention and education. We intend to focus on engagement with our young ones, guided by strategies outlined in this report. Our prevention project, Loving Oneself, Understanding and Building Healthy Relationships, is curriculum we developed that is aimed at promoting positive interpersonal relationships. This is just one example of how we intend to use this action plan as we move ahead. Our relationship does not end here. It is only the beginning. The Women's Secretariat will be working with Sass to find ways to bring its sexual violence first responder training to include individuals, community leaders, and employers in our First Nations communities. There is so much work ahead if we want to change the status quo. And from my experience as a community advocate and as a First Nations elected leader, I know that this work cannot be done alone. We need to unite in this common cause, and together we can build a strong support system and coordinate our efforts. We are stronger together. With that, I would like to thank the Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan staff and the research team, Dr. Finley and Dr. Levrod of the University of Saskatchewan, Community University Institute for Social Research for all your, I want to thank you for all your hard work and dedications. And also I want to make a special, my special gratitude to the survivors who participated. And your dedication is so welcomed towards completing, working together, your voice, your story, your action, Saskatchewan Sexual Violence Action Plan. May we soon experience that day where no one lives in fear or threat of sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chief. I would now like to invite Dr. Isabel Finley, co-director of CUSAR, the Community University Institute for Social Research. She is going to speak to the research partnership, the objectives, and the methodology. Welcome, Isabel. Sorry, Isabel, you're on mute.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ashley. I want to start by saying I have the privilege of living and working on Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homelands of the Métis. And I want to thank Elder Maria Linklater for her good guidance and for the candor, commitment, and clarity of all those who've spoken so far that have reminded us why we're in this together. And indeed, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations and Prince Albert Grand Council have been valued partners of Sass and CUSAR in our journey to develop and deliver this study and the Saskatchewan Sexual Violence Action Plan that it has supported. CUSAR began in and with the community. And remains unique at the university in being co-governed equally by community and faculty. In this study, as throughout our 20-year history, our role is to facilitate and to nourish partnerships across communities, cultures, and sectors for community-driven social research that supports deeper understanding and reveals opportunities for improving our quality of life. FSIN's Women's Commission Advisory Circle gave critical guidance in developing the methodology to ensure questions and approaches reflected trauma and violence-informed practice when conducting research in Indigenous communities. PAGC's Women's Commission also gave valuable guidance in engaging Northern communities and responding to what we learned. Guided by both FSIN and PAGC's Women's Commissions and the Saskatchewan Sexual Violence Action Plan Advisory Committee, the research team set out to develop a comprehensive understanding of sexual violence in Saskatchewan, and in particular to learn from the experience of sexual violence survivors and support service providers to identify the strengths as well as the gaps within service provision. Although Saskatchewan was the first province in Canada to introduce its Victims of Interpersonal Violence Act in 1994, it's the last province to develop a sexual violence action plan. The research findings are the foundation of the 22 actions outlined in Working Together, the first Saskatchewan Sexual Violence Action Plan. Overall, research participation involved more than 1,000 survivors and support service members in 820 surveys, complemented by 24 interviews and 37 focus groups conducted in 22 communities across the province. All primary survivors were over 18 years of age at the final stage of healing and supported by counselor or first responders in attendance. The voices of participants with lived expertise were key in this collaborative decolonizing community action research project. We acknowledge with deep gratitude their courage and commitment to share their knowledge and experience so that we could all understand, acknowledge our roles and responsibilities in the healing journey, and take action together. Our commitment to them is to keep their voices alive, to deliver their messages in diverse venues to increase public awareness and education, and to ensure the necessary changes to make Saskatchewan a place where all are free from the threat of sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. I would now like to invite Dr. Marie Lovard from Women and Gender Studies at the University of Saskatchewan to speak on behalf of Survivors' Voices. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I too am joining this meeting from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Metis. I would like to thank Elder Linklater and all the previous speakers for the contextual remarks that they have provided. No one knows better than survivors and their allies what the stakes are in providing, or indeed not providing, appropriate services. Productivity losses alone due to violence and sexual violence in the home and at work are staggering, and the individual harm and impact on interpersonal relationships is also critical. When abused children are denied service providers with specialized pediatric training in healthcare responses, when healthcare facilities lack private spaces for survivors and their supporters, and there are not specialized sexual assault nurse examiners on every shift in every hospital, and when law enforcement and judicial appointees, including jury members, are not provided with in-depth trauma-informed training, then the people targeted for sexual assault fall through the cracks in Saskatchewan's public well-being and safety net, and the harm done by perpetrators is facilitated. Sexual violence against targeted groups and individuals, women and girls, Indigenous people, members of queer communities, people with disabilities, those with unaddressed histories of sexual violence, including residential school survivors, people in rural and remote communities, youth in and from government care, refugees, and immigrants are all facilitated by structural violence and forms of coercion that persist within our institutions and communities. Therefore, we all need to be part of the solution rather than contributing to the problem. Here are just a few quotations from the harrowing stories that we encountered in our research, and also beginning to suggest some of the opportunities to do better that emerged through the report. So one survivor said, "If I could go back and change anything, I would never have reported my assault. If I get raped 100 times in this lifetime, 100 rapists will walk free because the damage caused by the justice system is just as bad, if not worse." Another said, "People don't really want you to always tell the truth." Another, "What if you don't survive? What if you're still broken?" If every hotel could provide just one safe space for one survivor, it would make a tremendous difference. People who make the rules sit in a whole different place of privilege. The full report is filled with painful stories of survivors, too often sidelined in healthcare and judicial processes, the latter of which are designed to uphold perpetrator rights and treat survivors simply as evidence. Because sexual assault occurs when perpetrators dehumanize their victims and treat them as objects, constructing sexual assault victims as merely evidence in legal processes repeats that violence. Survivors in Saskatchewan are too often denied access to trauma-informed, culturally appropriate training among healthcare, judicial, and other public service providers. They must navigate misinformed communities, institutions, and industries that do not take the violence which informs tough guy socialization from the playground to the boardroom to the street gang seriously. Mutual flourishing is possible only when our cultures and economies uphold local capacities to care for one another and for the earth that sustains us. One survivor who is not alone commented, "I have been sexually assaulted more times than I can bear to recall. You never really feel safe or prepared, and for me, it just got harder to cope with each time." The national average of sexual assaults is approximately 58 per 100,000, but in Saskatchewan, It's 104 assaults per 100,000, so roughly double the national average. This occurs because Saskatchewan's social and economic structures reinforce gender-based violence. We are nowhere near gender pay equity in this province so that survivors can escape their abusers. Industry and sports cultures here continue to normalize the sexualization of women and girls and the targeting of queer and trans communities. Saskatchewan sustains a culture of perpetration, where it is not uncommon for people to talk about the vulnerabilities of target population, even though there is absolutely nothing about any victim ever that makes them a target. The decision to undertake or ignore an assault is made by perpetrators and their supporters alone. Yet there is very little attention paid to the conditions that are producing such large numbers of perpetrators in our province. By the stats, more than 88% of primary and secondary survivor responses were female, while men represented 8.35% of victims reporting sexual violence. Combined responses from primary and secondary survivors indicated that about 1.5% of survivors who participated in the study identified as two-spirit individuals, and about 1.75% were transgender. In many of the communities we visited, social and economic structures reinforce narratives of male dominance and sexual aggression against women, children, vulnerable individuals, and feminized males. Many female survivors perceived and experience in their daily lives a continuum of sexual violence that ranges from unwanted sexual remarks to sexual touching to sexual assault. Next slide, please. Victimization starts at a young age and increases vulnerability for future victimization. One survivor comment, "I was often not kept safe at home and still don't feel safe even though I am very educated. So I've had a lot of unwanted sexual contact starting when I was 5. More than half of the assaults occurred between the ages of 13 and 24 years old. Children and youth were more frequently assaulted by a family member at 34 or 35%, an acquaintance at 24%, and a friend at 23%. These assaults happen most frequently in their homes and schools. 66% of the survivors who experienced childhood abuse went on to experience multiple incidents of adult sexual assault. Adults were assaulted most often by strangers at 27%, acquaintances at 22%, and intimate partners at 21%, although the variations in these figures are slight. Many survivors experienced victimization from multiple perpetrators. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I would now like to invite Patience Umerwendenza, project coordinator of Sass, to share the rest of the research findings. Welcome, Patience.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm joining you today from Treaty 4 territory in Regina and echo the sentiments of my colleagues in my commitment to decolonizing my work, my relationships, my practices in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. So I'm going to continue the rest of the findings. And right now we're talking about our finding number 3. Most survivors chose not to report the assault. So in this context, we're speaking about disclosures and reports. Disclosures mean telling another person about the incident of sexual abuse or assault. The disclosure may be of a recent incident, it may have occurred in the past, or it may be ongoing. A survivor's choice to disclose should be treated as distinct from making a report to formal authorities, even if sometimes they're one and the same event. Disclosures are primarily motivated by the need for safety, protection, and support, seeking information to clarify their understanding of the assault and not wanting to be alone. Furthermore, previous research shows that the process of disclosure is not linear, neat, coherent, and timely disclosures should be regarded as the exception rather than the rule. So in our study, we found that the vast majority of primary survivors, 71%, told someone about their assault at one point or another. The majority of the disclosures were made to friends, family members, and then, people outside of their homes, such as school counselors, mental health counselors. We also found that more than 1/3, 37% of these disclosures happened within the first 1 to 3 days following the assault. However, if the disclosure was not made within those first few days, it would often take survivors up to more than 2 years before they made a disclosure of assault. So that means that we have people walking around with trauma that they are keeping within themselves and haven't shared with anyone. So how a disclosure is received is a key determinant on whether or not survivors would go on to formally report the assault, seek further services, and to disclose other or future instances of sexual assault experiences. And when disclosures are minimized, dismissed, or the survivors are blamed for the assault, this harmed the survivor's ability to move forward with their healing journey. In the cases of children and youth, dismissed disclosures led to further re-victimizations as minors and into adulthood. To quote a survivor on her disclosure experience, she said, "I experienced at least 4 assaults between the ages of 12 and 17. Regarding the first, I told 4 friends and 1 adult. They did and said nothing. This taught me that being assaulted was shameful. I did not tell anyone anything about my sexual history after that." This speaks to the need to educate the community as a whole, people in families and communities, not just service providers, on how to receive a disclosure appropriately in order to ensure that survivors can obtain the specialized services and supports that they need. Now, in the case of reports, formal reports, we found that fewer than 1/3 of primary survivors, at 23.7, made a formal report to police or RCMP. And the main reasons were fear of not being believed or blamed for the assault, fear of being shamed, the embarrassment, fear of retaliation from the perpetrator or the perpetrator's network, anonymity concerns, lack of understanding that sexual assault is a crime, especially if there's been manipulation happening in that relationship, lack of trust of the law enforcement's ability to handle sexual assault cases, and fear of the criminal court process. In children and youth, this misapprehension was often due to being young and unable to comprehend the assault as such, as well being manipulated by the perpetrator, as I said, into believing that the assault is not a crime. And for adult survivors of sexual assault, a common issue was the lack of understanding that sexual assaults can happen within the context of intimate partner relationship. You do have the right to consent to any sexual encounter you have, even if you're in a relationship with someone. And as quoted by a survivor, "I did not tell police because I had no idea those such assaults were illegal. I thought they were my fault and that I was disgusting for having them happen to me. I was ashamed and embarrassed." And another survivor was quoted saying, "I couldn't really believe it happened. One of the people who did the worst assault was my boyfriend at the time, who was also manipulative and emotionally abusive. So I thought he didn't mean to do it. It took me a few years to fully realize he actually raped me." Next slide. Number 4, survivors face numerous barriers in accessing services and supports. Our study found that less than half of primary survivors access at least one form of service and support in relation to a sexual assault incident. 1/3 of respondents had no access to sexual assault services of any kind. That said, it was very clear from our travels around the province that service providers are working hard to meet demands for supports in their communities, although needs are much higher than can be addressed by current resources. As a result, some survivors found the quality of the services to which they had access to be unreliable or patchy. However, for many others, numerous barriers prevented them from fully accessing much needed services. Some of these barriers included anonymity concerns, previous negative experiences with service providers, lack of transportation, poverty, addiction, and the list goes on as outlined in the chart. Other barriers highlighted at the last bar at the bottom there, 26.3%, include shame, being blamed for the assault, homophobia, and transphobia, lack of inclusive services, lack of support from friends and family, lack of services for minor and youth, lack of Indigenous services, internalized belief about what constitutes a serious sexual assault, requiring formal supports, mental illness, being told that the assault was not legitimate, fear of retaliation from the perpetrator, limiting operating hours of agencies, access to services in languages other than English, and culturally appropriate services were also other areas of concerns. The implication of not accessing supports and services means that we have individuals and families dealing with profound trauma that impacts their health and well-being. In fact, sexual violence has been identified as the root cause for mental illness, addictions, homelessness, domestic violence, self-harm, suicide, and many other socioeconomic issues. Next slide. Law enforcement and the criminal justice system were identified as the most difficult and traumatic systems to navigate. Primary survivors, their families, and service providers reported that the law enforcement services, court services, and other legal services proved to be the most difficult system to navigate and were implicated for inflicting secondary trauma to survivors of sexual violence. In terms of law enforcement services, survivors, their families, and sexual violence advocates alike reported an overwhelming lack of understanding on the part of law enforcement agencies to the power dynamics that affect sexual violence crime, of historical context informing the way sexual violence continues to be supported and perpetrated against members of Indigenous communities, and the structural oppression faced by various marginalized groups. There was an overwhelming lack of sensitivity to the intimate nature of sexual violence violations, a lack of understanding of traumatic responses that affect how survivors recount memories, behave during and after an assault, and violence-informed processes in engaging with survivors during the investigative process. We were more likely to hear references to concerns about false reporting from law enforcement professionals and affiliated community volunteers, rather than commitments to ensure that the sexual assault reports were investigated thoroughly. Therefore, any non-stereotypical behaviors exhibited by survivors that may have been rooted in trauma, fear, memory loss, anxiety, power dynamics, and others were quickly dismissed as lies on the survivor's part. A consistent phrase used was the need to ensure that the survivor does not ruin someone's life by making an assault allegation. In many cases, this took precedence over collecting witness statements or providing the survivor with appropriate community referrals. This is a prevailing myth that women in particular lie about sexual assaults and that there are many innocent men convicted of assaults. However, data shows that false allegations account for 2 to 5% of sexual assault reports. And so that means that in 100% of the time, 95% of the time, survivors are telling the truth. And the other 5% of the time, they might be lying. But when survivors are treated as lying until proven otherwise, it takes away from looking into the case thoroughly. So to quote a survivor, she said, "I regret going to the police 100%. Out of the 5 officers I ended up dealing with only one who treated me with dignity and respect. I was criticized for drinking. I was doubted because I was assaulted twice in one night. I was accused once of maybe just making it all up to hide an affair. I was treated like I was guilty, and the station didn't take me seriously because I had not reported it the morning after. Victim services were not much help. She talked to the chief officer, but he was also part of the problem. The whole experience was degrading, shaming, and left me feeling even more hopeless. I complained that officers of law should have sexual assault victim training and a better understanding of victim services, but that went nowhere." In terms of court and legal services, the most common complaint was the difficulty in navigating a complex criminal and justice system with very little supports and with little consideration to sexual violence trauma. In many cases, survivors were not able to get adequate orientation and follow up on their cases in the court process, which led to so much confusion and anxiety. There were numerous accounts of lawyers, judges, and court staff lacking understanding of sexual violence trauma, leading to poor treatment and re-victimization of the survivors throughout court proceedings. The defense was able to use rape myths, stereotypes, sexist, racist, ageist rhetoric, and the survivor's traumatic response to the assault as evidence that the assault didn't occur, and these were allowed to be presented in court. In many rural and remote communities, the courtrooms were situated in public town halls or community centers and were considered public events. These makeshift court facilities were not consistently equipped with adequate meeting rooms. We heard stories of lawyers and survivors meeting in broom closets prior to case starting because there was no private meeting space. There were consistently not equipped with tools and technologies needed to preserve the rights of survivors to safety and emotional well-being during court proceedings. Survivors share that court day was considered entertainment and was often attended by multiple members of the community. This made the ordeal very difficult because survivors had to recount the sexual assault incident not only in front of the accused, but also in front of their entire community. In one incident, a child had to walk past the accused, sit behind a whiteboard, and share his abuse story in front of the whole community. We've heard stories of survivors also being attacked at the parking lot or within the community just other areas in the community by the perpetrator's family who had attended court day as part of the public event. And so two common phrases that we have heard from survivors is the fact that there is no justice in the justice system and that the court trial was worse than the rape itself. Next slide. There are no provincial care standards for sexual assault survivors presenting in medical facilities, including hospitals. The healthcare system is often the first point of contact for survivors following a recent sexual assault. Survivors may be seeking forensic examinations, support for acute medical needs, including prevention of sexually transmitted infections and unwanted pregnancies, referrals for counseling support, and reassurance and guidance from an informed professional. Less than 1/3 of survivors access medical services for the assault incident, and a combined total of 53 primary survivors reported obtaining forensic examinations, either from referrals from police officers or hospital personnel. The most common reason for not seeking medical attention were shame, humiliation, lack of knowledge of the process, fear of being judged, and anonymity concerns. However, there are currently no provincial standards of sexual assault survivors for how sexual assault survivors are treated when presenting in medical facilities, doctors' offices, including hospitals. Survivors with negative experiences identified key area of concerns, including problematic triage and intake protocols, lack of trauma and violence-informed approaches by medical personnel, which ultimately stigmatize patients, and the lack of referral and follow-up services. Survivors have been made to sit in waiting rooms for up to 8 hours at a time. Survivors have been discharged in the middle of the night with a dressing gown. There has been very few case planning before survivors are being discharged to check to see what the safety of the places that they're going back to. Survivors were judged by their physical attributes such as age, race, gender, and even tattoo markings if they had a previously known history of interpersonal violence, drug and alcohol addiction, mental illness, or attending the hospital under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They also received poor treatment. There's also a significant lack of expertise in supporting male survivors and members of the queer community. Particularly poignant case was shared by a service provider who had accompanied a male adult survivor to have a forensic completed in the hospital. Upon meeting the patient, the physician laughed and expressed disbelief that a man could be sexually assaulted. The survivor was visibly uncomfortable during that very intrusive medical examination as it was, and was reluctant to seek further services following that encounter. So it's worth noting, however, it is worth noting that survivors with positive experiences praise the care given by medical personnel who were compassionate, gentle, and non-judgmental. Many of the doctors and nurses so commended were trained and or supported by hospital administrations in providing well-informed post-assault medical care and in collecting forensic evidence. Other notable mentions were family doctors who took the time to listen to survivors' concerns, provided follow-up care and referrals as needed. The sexual assault nurse examiner program at the Regina General and Pasco hospitals received considerable applaud for compassionate and thorough care by survivors. Next slide. So all the research participants were asked to share their perspectives on key practices, procedures, partnerships, and programming that had been beneficial to them, and to identify potential solutions that would address sexual violence in communities across the province. With reconciliation as the first principle, we have themed the responses based on the core service framework as the image to provide context and clarity. In each of these themes that emerged from the data, we outlined identified successes to affirm what's working and recommended actions to identify the improvements that can be made. A limitation to note is that participants could not speak to services and supports that they did not have access to, often for a variety of reasons. Therefore, this is not an exhaustive list of what is working, what current services are available, and what improvements can be made. Rather, what follows is a summary of identified successes and recommended actions that participants have shared through surveys, interviews, focus groups, based on their personal experiences. And I would encourage you to look at the report on that section of the way forward to look at the full recommendations that were outlined. Next slide. So, the findings of this research study has informed the development of the first ever Sexual Violence Action Plan in Saskatchewan. And that plan has 4 foundational components and outlines 22 key actions that will improve Saskatchewan's responses to sexual assaults. The Provincial Advisory Committee had access to the report last year, and they took all the findings and all the areas the survivors provided recommendations and broke them down into 22 key actions. And the responsibility to address sexual violence, as said by Betty Ann, does not belong to one particular sector, but rather it requires a coordinated, cross-ministerial and multi-sectoral approach. Next slide. So this year, this past year has been the beginning of our initial implementation year. And we have identified 4 actions to start off, where we can take a leadership role and engage potential funders in the near future. The action that has received government funding from the Government of Saskatchewan to date is Action 19. On May 6, 2019, the Government of Saskatchewan provided funding to conduct an 18-month pilot project on integrated victim advocate case reviews of all sexual violence cases in Regina area. The case reviews involve the Regina Sexual Assault Center and the Regina Police Service. And Sass is also supporting the RCMP in conducting their own case reviews using a trauma-informed model. Our hope is that advocate case reviews will become a standard part of the investigative chain across the province. And we also plan to create a multi-sectoral steering committee to support the 5-year strategic work plan of the action plan moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Patience. I would now like to invite Carrie Isaac, the Executive Director of Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan, to provide remarks on behalf of Sass and thank yous. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you to everyone for being here this morning and to the media for joining us today. As Ashley said, my name is Carrie Isaac and I'm the Executive Director of Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan. This report being released today is a culmination of 9 months of data collection that gives voices to Saskatchewan sexual assault survivors, tells their stories, and shows us the state of sexual violence in the province. This important work follows on the heels of Sass's provincial action plan entitled Working Together, Your Voice, Your Story, Your Action, that was released in May 2019. That action plan and this research provides a provincial framework that coordinates services, defines actions, and builds partnerships to collectively address sexual violence in the province. I would like to thank all the survivors who bravely shared their experience for this research and the action plan. Survivors, their friends and family drive the work that we do. Your courage and hope and determination is inspiring. I would also like to recognize the collaboration and the relationship that made this research possible. That included the Community University Institute for Social Research at the University of Saskatchewan and our member agencies. We could not do this work alone, and we acknowledge the contributions of individuals, agencies, and communities and governments working to address all forms of interpersonal violence and abuse in the province. Our vision is a Saskatchewan where everyone is free from threat, fear, or experience of sexual violence. Together, we can make this happen. With the appropriate investment and engagement, this report and the action plan will put us on that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. I am now going to stop the screen share and we're going to go back together this way. And before we close out, I'm going to invite Elder Maria back again to guide us in a thank you prayer. Welcome, Elder.
Okay, there you go. Closing it.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
How nanas kumun gahkigi ko che o magagisi tamasya yo kami nakasapu taya sko kawichi haya ko uski sko mina evo uskini swessak yo kami no skini ko Göksinä maa ko matsuun tän se ei siike vaikka tutama kapiks kotta mehoma. Hagat veitsin vitsenan katoa tutama kiwe. Ega nan toki kespatin gea. Ega minä kaikis muuta tämän muja suon. Uista alka kun pitus suepin ketsik. Ega minä ne hiogi we kapata. Mugata sue suon kiwe. Ega minä kisko kamai tutasik. Kanaka teimitsik. Meu smagan saka mam skutame ekse. Not smagan sewakin ki taksit ekse suon kistuta tahta uisko. Ekse skeittaman. Tän siskokin suitsiisikat piitsikenen askumana joki voitse. You know, when women are sexually assaulted, or boys, young boys, or even older men, it's really, really hard for them to talk about it, because what happens is right away they want to call the police, and then all of a sudden the person that really needs help is forgotten. It's more important to try and get somebody to the justice system. When a person can heal first and then talk about it, get well, and share it with their family. You know, I find that's a best way to do it, because I've been to court with women, you know, that have been abused, sexually abused. And, you know, the majority of them lost. The woman ended up getting hurt more because of she didn't remember, or she made a different statement. And nobody really supported her when she was making a statement. So sometimes she didn't remember. And when she was asked in court, she told a different story. So we have to really know how to help women. And also I know of a young boy, a 17-year-old young boy, that was raped on a weekend. So he went out and he found himself naked, all alone in this house. And he had hickeys all over. And he was crying, and he went to school because he had no place to go. And my little grandson found him crying. So my grandson asked him what happened. So my grandson told him to tell his mom right away, but he didn't want to tell his mom because he wasn't supposed to go out. He was going to get into big trouble. He didn't want to tell. So my grandson took him to the principal, and then he told the principal what happened. So they eventually called the mom. And my little grandson, you know, right through stood beside him. So like, we have to know how to help people, no matter what it is. And again, drinking was involved, and he didn't remember what happened. So it's sad when these things happen to our young men too. And also the women have to get well, like all name calling, like they'll call them Krugers or lions, you know, things like that. All those are very hurtful things. But we have to teach our women to get well, to teach them, and also to do their best to live a lifestyle without booze and drugs, and also not to make men important. Women don't need men, and same thing with men don't need women unless a relationship is sacred. But I find too many times they'll break up with somebody, they'll find somebody right away. And that's no love there. You know, love takes a long time to develop. And we need to be honest with these relationships. And not to be afraid to talk. Like, I'm not afraid to talk about anything, me. You know, I know what I'm talking about. If I don't know what I'm talking about, I'll get somebody that knows that to talk about these things. But, you know, we have to address everything. And if we're going to start this, we'll never finish. We'll just have to keep on going. You know, and this is a prayer, you know, to talk to Creator, to ask for guidance. And I'll continue to pray, and I'll take these webinars when I go to my first sweat as soon as this pandemic is over.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Elder Maria. In closing, I am going to share a couple verses from a poem written by Audre Lorde. It is called The Litany for Survival. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Thank you. And now what I'm going to do before we go into question period is that I am going to unmute everybody. I'm going to welcome everybody to join in a large round of applause for all the incredible people, the knowledge, the stories, the work that has been shared today and that will go forward to create change within our province. So I'm going to unmute you all and let's all give a big round of applause. All right, thank you everybody for that. We are now going to open up for question period. So for those of you who are joining us from the media, if you could use the chat function just to share your name, where you're coming from, and I will call you, invite you forward to answer or ask a question. Hi, Mandy. We have Mandy Voke here from Global News that has a question. I will find you here, Mandy, so we can bring you forward. It doesn't look like I can bring your... Okay, Mandy, you can come forward and ask a question.
Okay, thank you for having me. I would just like to ask, is there anything in particular that stands out from this research? And moving forward, what can we do with this information?
Okay, maybe I'll try and answer. Or Marie, did you want to answer that? Okay. The key findings are outlined in our executive summary. You know, there were a lot. Like, this was a research that spanned over 9 months, so there were a lot of findings, and what we presented to you are probably some of the key ones. And using our core service model, you know, we tried to identify which systems probably had some of the most, like, what was the most pertinent issues that had to be addressed. And so the executive summary would give you that, and we took that information, presented that to the to the provincial advisory committee, and they used that to develop the 22 actions that are outlined in the action plan. So in the action plan, it tells you what we think are the key steps that we need to take within the next 5 years to address sexual violence that are like the most urgent, with the idea that we keep renewing that action plan in the years to come. And the areas that we thought were very important to focus on was around prevention and education, really changing the societal attitudes around, you know, sexism, racism, all those kinds of attitudes and myths that seep into the way people do their work, the way we respond to someone who gives a disclosure and that sort of thing. And then we looked into intervention, really, how do we make sure that our intervention processes are coordinated, are well-rounded, take into account the historical intergenerational trauma of Indigenous communities. And then the systems that we mentioned that were the most difficult was law enforcement and criminal justice system. That had its own separate component with actions outlined there to really address that, because that was a system that survivors said as just being the most traumatic for them. And we also included a couple actions for mental and medical services, so our health system. And then our last component was around collaboration and leadership, really championing leaders across all sectors to come together, because we recognize that this issue was being carried by a few systems, really, like primarily the justice system, social services. You know, I think we're probably the two systems that we saw carrying the bulk of this. And while there are improvements that could be made on their part, I think that that load should be shared across ministries. And we saw also absence of other systems in that discussion. One in such includes, you know, the health system. So I think we really talked about trying to get those people in, but also getting the business sector in, getting, you know, we saw that there were ad hoc community services that were already doing this work. And they just probably needed more support and training in there. So, you know, what we're also looking is how to bring everybody into this conversation. So when you ask, what should we do going forward? It's the 22 actions outlined. That's what we need to focus on in the next 5 years, and getting everybody engaged in that, however way they can be part of that. There are more than enough actions for everybody to find something to do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patience. We have Zoklin joining us from Radio Canada Saskatchewan. Zo, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Patience. That answered most of my questions. I was just wondering if someone could summarize what are the strengths and weaknesses that you found in the services in Saskatchewan for sexual assaulted victims.
Marie, do you want to take that one?
I think that there were strengths and limitations in every one of the identified systems that we responded to. I was thinking I would just like to give one example as an indicator. So we had conversations, for instance, with people who deal with incarcerated women. And many of those women have been involved in the child welfare system. You know, they are subject to assault within the incarceration system, or it's not safe to talk about sexual assault in that kind of environment. So, you know, when you think about those quotations from survivors that we gave you today, you know, people who've had multiple sexual assaults that have never been addressed, right? And then you think about what the odds are of somebody getting healing support in that situation that's specific to their particular social position, right? It's very, very slim, right? Another example, sort of beyond the ones that have been talked about here, you know, think about the impacts of historical assaults. If the services that we have now need to be improved, if the community needs to be better informed, if we all need to respond better to disclosures, imagine if this happened 50 years ago, where there was almost no one. Maybe you would tell a friend or a sister, but many people have never had the support that they needed, and they're carrying that into their interpersonal relationships. So I think in terms of strengths, I think we have tremendous will. Certainly when Sass and the research team met with social service ministers, justice ministers, education ministers, and so on, there was a will to take action. But at the same time, we've got a lot of ground to cover. When we've got twice the number of known assaults compared to the rest of the country, clearly we all have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. We have a question from Cole Davenport with CTV Regina. Welcome, Cole.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for holding this. My question just surrounds for this research going forward. In what way do you hope to see the topics covered here used potentially towards changes?
I'm going to pass that on to Isabel, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks for the question. One of the challenges in this area is the persistent silence, the discomfort with talking about these issues, about unpacking the stories we tell ourselves. So for example, in the justice system, seeing is believing, right? That's the well-known idiom. And the problem is that seeing is never neutral. We see what we expect to see. We don't see what we don't want to see. These are among the biggest challenges that we have, that this is an area that people find very difficult to deal with. It challenges the stories we tell about ourselves, about our values, about what's important to us. And what we've seen in recent times, you know, in the context of the COVID crisis, of the tragedy in Nova Scotia, we're seeing amplified the fault lines in our cultures, in our self-understandings. So that's why I think we're all committed to amplifying the voices of the survivors who had such courage to tell their stories. So for us, it's about going into as many different venues as we can. We cannot rely only on a written report or a set of actions. We have to take personal responsibility and be part of the solution. So I hope that gives you some sense of both the challenge, but also the opportunity for us all to play a part. Thank you.
I wanted to add to also Isabel's comment to Cole, is that like, you know, the limitation that we also saw with the report is that there really needs to be an in-depth environmental scan of services and supports, you know, to just get a look of what is actually available to survivors in the province, and how can we ensure that those services are provided in a trauma and violence informed manner. A lot of it is not that the services are wrong, they just need to be tweaked to make sense to the realities of survivors in the communities. And I think that this report, being the first comprehensive sexual violence report in the province, will be sort of, you know, it's the beginning of the body of work of sexual violence research. We hope that it's used to make evidence-informed decisions by lawmakers, policymakers. And so for us, you know, we'll continue to explore that. We also look forward to future funding opportunities for other issues, you know, including, let's say, examining the experiences of individuals who experience sexual exploitation and trafficking and human trafficking. You know, so there are other areas that we've touched on with the research that we weren't able to do an in-depth dive, that we hope that that gets funded in the future, because it all allows us to provide services that really make sense to the survivors and actually target the issues. So that's, I think, a big area that we're also hoping to go forward with this report.
I would also like to add something to that. I think it's really important to understand the cultures of perpetration. And, you know, one of the things that we all have to face is that perpetrators are sometimes themselves survivors, that we have a long history in Canada and Saskatchewan of colonization, of institutions reinforcing different kinds of violence, which make people reluctant to come forward. And I think we also need to understand that, as Isabel said, because people see what they want to see and don't see what they don't want to see, we are participating in cultures of perpetration, and we have to understand those in order to prevent them.
Thank you, everyone. Heather Polishuk with Leader Post has a question. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, thanks. I just had a question about the criminal justice system aspect. I know that's been discussed quite a bit. I've covered court for quite a few years, so I've, had to unfortunately see what you're talking about quite a bit in terms of victims having to suffer that essentially, I think, what feels like a second victimization to them. However, there's also the other side of that, and I was really curious to see, I think, what perspective people might have. I mean, certainly our system is set up to ensure that people are innocent until proven guilty, and there's, therefore a heavy and detailed testing of evidence as a result. So, I mean, because of that, those questions need to be asked quite often in court proceedings. So I'm always just curious, like, what is the balance? Like, what do people in the group here see as that balance?
I'm going to pass that to Marie, and then I'll take it on if there's anything left.
I think that there is a real difference between treating a human being as a piece of evidence and treating them as a human being. And the truth is that because legal systems were set up in the period of colonization, they are informed by all that violence that connects into the nation state. And what that means is, if the perpetrator has to be assumed innocent until proven guilty, so should the survivor. And, that just does not seem like rocket science to me. The other thing I think that we really need to be mindful of is that the court system is adversarial, right? It's set up as a binary in which, two sides of a case are presented to an event that probably took place without witnesses at the actual assault very often. So, we're somebody who's experienced a very invasive adversarial violent situation is thrown into another one. And there are lots of ways that can be mitigated. When we talk about things like people being attacked in the parking lot outside of a court case that was held in a community center where everybody could come and where there was no opportunity for the survivor to speak their story, on camera away from that space, or in a protected way. These are opportunities to do better that really matter. I also think we really need to take seriously the notion that at the end of the day, the survivor has to proceed from that court case, which is a public event, into their life after that. So, I think we need to take very seriously the kinds of supports that we make available to survivors. I mean, so many voices said that they didn't come forward because they knew about the adversarial nature of the court system, or they wished they hadn't. We can't have that. That is actually part of the problem. If we are basically making it impossible to pursue criminal justice responses that are respectful of survivors, we're never going to get to the bottom of this. So I think that there's a lot of ways. One of the things I was really pleased to hear was the notion that all judges and court officials and lawyers should have first responder and trauma-informed training, so that they don't leap to conclusions when somebody, as Elder Linklater pointed out, we know that trauma affects memory, and that over time, memory emerges. right? So to treat somebody as if they're a liar because they're a human being with human brain cells is really wrong. And we need to do better than that. Over to you, Patience.
I think, thank you, Maria. Marie, that was very good. The
Yeah.
other thing I think that we have to, I think, maybe emphasize is what we would like to see, and I think what survivors would like to see, is a criminal justice system where when you go in and report, you're treated with dignity, and that processes are done in a way that's comprehensive and thorough. What tends to happen is that right from the get-go, from the moment you enter that police station, you are likely to be, maybe not so much now, but survivors were telling us that they were treated as if they were lying, as if they were exaggerating their stories. And so, you know, when you think about the difference of anyone else coming into a police station to report a crime versus a sexual assault survivor, or, you know, just a person, you know, one of the things we say to police officers is you don't have to believe, you know, the survivor, but you have to believe that something happened, and you have to at least give it the benefit of treating it in a thorough and comprehensive manner. So that's the first issue where, you know, people don't necessarily get that treatment. And in terms of the court, you know, studies have shown that gender biases and rape myths have been used in court cases that really cloud judgment. Expert witnesses are not brought in to explain traumatic responses. And that has been something that has been struck down and has been, you know, that's actually outlined within our criminal justice system that shouldn't be allowed in our court systems. But we do know that those continue to happen. And so when we hear comments such as what Robin Camp said, why didn't you keep your legs closed? Or the judge in Quebec who said you were wearing a thong that day, so you were expecting sex that day. That is not necessary for the other side to be able to get a fair and due trial. You know, and I think like what Marie's saying is, you know, we would like for, you know, I think in the perfect world, everyone should be able, if they would like, go to court, get the trial, and you know, and things, however they fall out, feel like they did what they needed to do. But what we're seeing is that when people go to court, they come out of there worse than when they went in. And some of the lawyers we spoke to said that, you know, they really are starting to speak to the survivors around the notion that they know that likely a conviction may not happen just because of how low conviction rates are. Majority of assaults are level 1 assaults, but the ones that get convictions are level 3 assaults. So, you know, and then of course, you know, just the way our justice system is set up. So one of the things they're talking about is how do we still ensure that there is justice despite of whatever the conviction is. And part of that justice is being treated with dignity and respect throughout the process, knowing that you can be able to say what you need to say, have a fair trial, you know, answer to whatever the other person says, but to be subjected to rape myths, to stereotypes. There was a court case recently in Regina where a woman was raped, a middle-aged woman, and the defense asked, could your cries be interpreted as cries of pleasure? And she was brutally assaulted in a way that the sexual assault nurse examiner said that she had never seen this, she had never seen bruises that bad. Are those necessary words to be brought into a court case? I don't think so. So we're not saying that the criminal justice system is necessarily, you know, that no one should go to court or that they should, you know, that the accused doesn't have the right to a fair trial, but we're saying that the survivor has a right to be treated with dignity and respect throughout the entire process. And it has to be taken into account the distinct psychology of trauma and violence that survivors of sexual violence experience. And that has to be taken into account. And everyone, including the jury, has to be oriented on that. Does that answer your question, Heather?
I'd like to add something, Patience, if I might. I also think that we need to think about anonymous reporting, because it should be possible for somebody to submit an anonymous report immediately, whenever they want, and that they have the liberty to share that report when they're ready, if they want to, but that if the same perpetrator comes up in another anonymous report, right, that the legal system gets motivated into doing something about that. I think that there really are many solutions available to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you.
Okay. Can I weigh in?
Yes, of course, Heather.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I just, when we talk about perspectives, I wanted to weigh in from a First Nations perspective and, you know, the overall thinking of the justice system. Now, we know even historically, this justice system has not always, we've had a dark past, I guess, and you know, the perspective is justice is not blind. You know, institutional racism and, you know, the marginalization, you know, that happens just because you're First Nation or Indigenous. You have these pre-ideas and assumptions, I guess, when it comes to right from the police and right through the whole court system. And like I say, the justice system has not always been our friend in terms of a First Nations lens, but you know, poverty and, you know, even dealing with the court system, even, you know, the whole thought of going to court, you know, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of intimidation. And like I say, it's that's supposed to be there to protect us and, you know, that system. But, you know, unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. And when we talk about the intergenerational impacts of the residential school, you know, some of the horrendous crimes against children and sexual abuse, and we talk about the survivor becoming the abuser, and you know, when you look within our communities, that's what we have to deal with, and with very limited resources. So, you know, whether you need, you know, that counseling or support, and that's what I'm hoping this report will bring to the table, some, you know, some viable solutions, you know, where we don't have the funding or the, you know, the, you know, to do the work within our communities, you know, because, you know, at the end of the day, I think we've resorted, our perspective in terms of justice, it kind of boils down to mindful forgiveness. That's when you talk to our elders and, you know, doing the work, restorative justice, those kinds of measures, you know, to really get the, you know, move through the healing. So I just wanted to bring that perspective to the table because, you know, we're talking about issues that are near and dear to my heart as I, you know, advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and many times, you know, sexual violence is a part of that. And the stories that I hear, the realities are, it's a different world being an Indian in terms of this justice system. So, yeah, thank you.
Ashley, may I add?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather, for reminding us. I actually wrote a major report for the First Nations and Métis Justice Reform Commission almost 20 years ago, and I swore that that would not lie on a shelf either, and that we had to keep it alive. And what was clear in my examination of every area of the law and the justice system was that they were instruments of colonization. And the good news is that finally we're beginning to decolonize and beginning the process of learning from Indigenous law and justice to rethink what we thought were the only ways of doing things. So rules of evidence are being changed. So that there's so many ways in which the law was itself and the justice system part of the violence of our collective histories. And so learning from Indigenous law and justice in the law schools is a significant change, and I think will be part of the process of healing for all. Thanks.
Thank you, Isabel. So Clayton from Radio Canada came back on and asked, could someone explain what is new compared to the previous research on this topic?
You're talking about what was released in May last year. That was just a preliminary report. So this is the long-awaited comprehensive report. But Sass itself has done bits and pieces, or the research that we've seen when we did our literature review was there were bits and pieces of research done on, like, you know, sexual violence experiences in northern Saskatchewan or with this specific demographic. So this is a more comprehensive report that covers a lot of ground. But if you're trying to compare with the previous report that we have on our website from May, it was just a preliminary kind of bite-sized piece of the report.
Thank you, Patience. I was just wondering, from my understanding, we know for a long time that Saskatchewan has a terrible rate of sexual assault, for example. We know that assaulters are like family members or relatives or people we know. Like, when I read your report, there are a lot of things that I think were already known by the community. And so I'm just trying to figure out what is new compared to all the studies that were done before on this topic.
Okay, I see what you mean. I think that the studies we have, if you look at some of the studies done, it does talk into, you know, some of the vulnerabilities to violence, some of the factors of violence that was, you know, Statistics Canada has outlined a lot of those things in their reports, and it also covers Saskatchewan. But the difference with this report is we went into the communities and talked to them about just the intricacies and the complexities of their experiences in Saskatchewan in relation to the services and supports available in Saskatchewan. And there is no study that has really done that, you know, where we can say this is what we know happens in rural communities versus remote communities versus urban areas, you know, and all of that. And in relation to the different population groups, you know, when we talk about members of the queer community or newcomers or so on and so forth. So I think the difference probably with maybe that general knowledge that we do know about sexual violence in the world, we've specialized it to our province to look at specific experiences here in relation to the services and supports that are available here.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add something to that too. I think that one of the things that happened in the communities that we visited is that more and more sites of abuse became clear. So for example, when people are evacuated because of fires in the north, and they're brought into you know, urban centers during the firefighting period, they're often separated from family members. Elders get separated from their families, kids get separated from their families. They're in you know, sometimes collective situations where sexual assaults can rise. And we absolutely have to be accountable for the ways that cyber assaults are going on. We have kids who don't understand, even as they participate in a culture of sharing you know, sexualized images of themselves or others with others, that they are legally liable, right, depending on the ages involved and so on. Like, it's a whole new area of sexual violence, revenge porn, all kinds of things like that. And the other thing we have to be mindful of, I mean, here we are sitting in this COVID situation and we're talking to each other on a Zoom meeting, right? People who do not have access to public transportation anymore may need to access counseling online, right? So we need to have responses to these new or previously unrecognized environments in which sexual assaults are taking place. You know, rural communities where it's hard to get to services, there's all kinds of ways that there are unique and new environments in which sexual assaults need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we are nearing noon. So I think we will use this time to wrap up. And I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who came and attended, who participated. And it was such a powerful morning. listening and being able to be here and listen to everyone. So the one thing that I did do, I know that for the media that is here, you already have my email as I sent it out for the media release yesterday. But for anybody that doesn't, I just put it in the group chat here, com.sass@sasstel.net, if anyone would like to request the full report. So, and we've got one more. Can you please share the video of the meeting you recorded? Yes, and we will be also posting the recording of this press conference on YouTube, so it will be available to the public within the next hour here. So with that, I would like to close officially and say a warm, big thank you for everybody that was here today.
Thank you.
Can we stay on, like the Sass team?
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do I exit here? Leave.